Hello everyone. Today I have a bit of a older book I'm going to be reading today. It goes by the name Red Notice. A true story on high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice. This book was written by Bill Browder. And from what I can read from the back, it is a story of Sergei Malinsky's life and death. It's a shocking true life thriller, and they are glad that Bill Browder is the one that wrote it. So, without any further interruptions, let's get into the book. A real life thriller about an American-born financier in the wild east of Russia, the murder of his principled young attorney, and his dangerous mission to expose the people responsible in the Kremlin. This story is about an accidental activist. Bill Browder started out his adult life as the Wall Street maverick whose instincts led him to Russia just after the breakup of the Soviet Union, where he made his fortune. Along the way, he exposed corruption, and when he did, he barely escaped with his life. His Russian lawyer wasn't so lucky. He ended up in jail, where he was tortured to death. That changed Browder forever. He saw the murderous heart of the Putin regime and has spent the last half-decade on a campaign to expose it. Because of it, he became Putin's number one enemy, especially after Browder succeeded in having a law passed in the United States that punished a list of Russians implicated in the lawyer's murder. Putin famously retaliated with a law that bans Americans from adopting Russian orphans. A financial carper, a crime thriller, and a political crusade, Red Notice is a story of one man taking an overpowering odd to change the world. It's also the story on how, without intending to, he found the meaning in his life. To Sergei Malinsky, the bravest man I've ever known. Everything in this book is true and will surely offend some very powerful and dangerous people. In order to protect the innocent, some names and locations have been changed. Red Notice, a communication issued by Interpol requesting the arrest of wanted persons. With a view to extradition, the Interpol Red Notice is the closest instrument to an international arrest warrant in use today. There is 42 chapters. I will see how long I can go on this. I'm not promising that I will be able to get through all 42 today, but that's the point of having multiple videos. So, without further ado, let's get into the book of the Red Notice. Chapter 1. Persona non grata, November 13th, 2005. I'm a numbers guy, so let's start with the important ones. 260 to 1 and 4.5 billion. Here's what they mean. Every other weekend, I traveled from Moscow, the city where I lived, to London, the city I called home. I'd made this trip 260 times over the last 10 years. The one purpose of this trip was to visit my son, David, then 8, who lived with my ex-wife in Hampstead. When we divorced, I made a commitment to him to visit him every other weekend, no matter what. I have never broken it. There were 4.5 billion reasons to return to Moscow so regularly. This was the total dollar value of assets under management of my firm, Hermitage Capital. I was the founder and CEO, and over the previous decade, I had made many people a lot of money. In 2000, the Hermitage Fund had been ranked as the best performing emerging markets fund in the world. We had generated returns of 1,500% for investors who had been with us since we launched the fund in 1996. The success of my business was far beyond my most opportunistic aspirations. Post-Soviet Russia had seen some of the most spectacular investment opportunities in the history of financial markets, and working there had been as adventurous and occasionally dangerous as it was profitable. It was never boring. I'd made the trip from London to Moscow so many times, I knew it backward and forward. How long it took to get through security at Heathrow, how long it took to board the Aeroflot plane, how it took off and fly east into the darkening country that, by mid-November, was moving fast into another cold winter. The flight time was 270 minutes. That was enough to skim the Financial Times, the Sunday Telegraph, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal, along with any important emails and documents. As the plane climbed, I opened my briefcase to get out the day's reading, along with the files and newspapers with glossy magazines with a small leather folder. In this folder was $7,500 in $100 bills. With it, I could have a better chance of being on the pivotal list last flight out of Moscow. Like those who had nearly escaped from Phnom Penh or Saigon before their countries fell into chaos and ruin. But I was not escaping from Moscow. I was returning to it. I was returning to work, and therefore I wanted to catch up on the week's end news. One Forbes article I read near the end of the flight caught my eye. It was a man named Zhu Xiao, a Chinese American who, like me, had an MBA from Stanford. He'd been a few years behind me at business school. I didn't know him, but also like me, he was a successful businessman in a foreign land. In his case, China. He had gone to a conference with some corrupt Chinese officials, and in April 1998, he was arrested after refusing to pay a $60,000 bribe to a tax collector in Shanghai. Xiao was eventually convicted on trumped-up charges and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Some Stanford alumni had organized a lobbying campaign to get him out, but it didn't work. As I read, Xiao was rotting away in some nasty Chinese prison. The article gave me the chills. China was 10 times safer than Russia when it came to doing business. For a few minutes, as the plane descended to 10,000 feet over Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, I wondered if perhaps I was being stupid. For my years, my main approach to investing had been shareholder activism. In Russia, that meant challenging the corruption of the oligarchs, the 20-year-old men who were reported to have stolen 39% of the country after the fall of communism, and who became billionaires almost overnight. The oligarchs owned a majority of the companies trading on the Russian stock market, and they were often robbing those companies blind. For the most part, I've been successful with my battles with them, and while my strategy made my fund successful, it also made me a lot of enemies. As I finished the story on Xiao, I thought, maybe I should cool it. I have a lot to live for. Along with David, I also had a new wife in London, Elenia, who was Russian, beautiful, incredibly smart, and very pregnant with our first child. Maybe I should give it a rest. But then the wheels touched down and I put the magazines away, powered up my BlackBerry, and closed my briefcase. I started checking emails. My focus turned from Jude Sao and his oligarchs to what I had missed while in the air. I had to get through customs, to my car, and back to my apartment. Sheremetyevo Airport is a strange place. The terminal that I was most familiar with was Sheremetyevo, which was built for the 1980 Summer Olympics. It had looked most impressive when it opened. By 2005, it was worse for wear. It smelled of wet and cheap tobacco. The ceiling was decorated with a row upon row of metal cylinders that looked like rusty cans of Folgers coffee. There was no formal line at the passport control, so you just had to take your place in the mass of people and stay on guard so no one jumped ahead of you. And God forbid you checked a bag. Even after your passport was stamped, you still have to wait another hour to claim your luggage. After a 4-hour plus flight, it's not a fun way to gain entry into Russia, particularly if you're doing a trip every other weekend as I was. I had done it since 1996, but around 2000, a friend of mine told me about a so-called VIP service. For a small fee, it saved around an hour, sometimes 2. It was by no means luxurious, but it was worth every penny. I was directed from the plane to the VIP lounge. The walls and ceiling were painted pea soup green, and the floor was tan linoleum. The lounge chairs, upholstered with a reddish-brown leather, were just comfortable enough. The servants there served weak coffee or overbrewed tea while you waited. I opted for the tea with a slice of lemon and gave the immigration officer my passport. Within seconds, I was engrossed in my BlackBerry's email dump. I barely noticed when my driver, Alexei, was authorized to enter the suite, come in, and start chatting with the immigration officer. Alexei was 41, like me. But unlike me, was 6'5", 240 pounds, blonde, and hard-featured. He was a former colonel with the Moscow traffic police and didn't speak a word of English. He was always on time and always able to talk his way out of minor jams with traffic cops. I ignored their conversation, answered emails, drank my lukewarm tea, and after a while an announcement came over the public address system that the baggage for my flight was ready for retrieval. That's when I looked up and thought, have I been in here for an hour? When I looked at my watch, I had been in there for an hour. My flight landed around 7:30, and now it was 8:32. The other two passengers from our flight were in the VIP lounge were long gone. I shot Alexei a look. He gave me one back that said, "Let me check." When he spoke with the agent, I called Alina. It was only 5:32 p.m. in London, so I knew she would be home. When we talked, I kept an eye on Alexei and the immigration officer. Their conversation quickly turned into an argument. Alexei topped the desk as a agent glared at him. "Something's wrong," I told Alina. I stood up and approached the desk, more irritated than worried, and asked what was going on. As I got closer, I realized something was seriously wrong. I put Alina on speakerphone and she translated it for me. Languages are not my thing. Even after 10 years, I still only spoke taxi Russian. The conversation went around and around. I watched like a spectator at a tennis match, my head bouncing back and forth. Alina at one point, "I think it's a visa issue, but the agent isn't saying." Just then 2 uniformed immigration officers entered the room. One pointed at my phone and the other at my bags. I said to Alina, "There are 2 officers here telling me to hang up and go with them. I'll call back as soon as I can." I hung up. One officer picked up my bags, the other collected my immigration papers. Before I left with them, I looked to Alexei. His shoulders and eyes drooped. His eyes slightly agape. He was at a loss. He knew that when things go bad in Russia, they usually go bad in a big way. I sat with the officers and we snaked through the back hallways of Shukov towards the larger, regular immigration hall. I asked them questions in my bad Russian, but they said nothing as they escorted me. They escorted me to a general detention room. The lights were harsh. The molded plastic chairs were bolted to the ground in rows. The beige paint on the walls peeled here and there. A few other angry-looking detainees lolled around. None talked. All smoked. The officers left. Sealed off behind a counter and glass partition on the far side of the room was a collection of uniformed agents. I chose a seat near them and tried to make sense of what was happening. For some reason, I was allowed to keep all my things, including my mobile phone, which had a workable signal. I took this as a good sign. I tried to settle in, but as I did, the story of Jude Shao registered in my mind. I checked my watch. 8:45 p.m. I called Alina back. She wasn't worried. She told me that she was preparing a briefing fax for the British embassy officials in Moscow and would fax it to them as soon as it was ready. I called Ariel, an Israel ex-Mossad agent who had worked as my company's security advisor in Moscow. He was widely considered to be one of the best in the country, and was confident he could sort this information and problem out. Ariel was surprised to hear what was happening. He said he would make some calls and get back to me. Around 10:30, I called the British embassy and spoke to a man named Chris Browse in a consul section. He received the fax from Alina and already knew my situation, or at least knew as much as I did. He double-checked all my information, date of birth, passport number, date my visa was issued, everything. He said it was because it was a Sunday night. He probably wouldn't be able to do much, but he would try. Before hanging up, he asked, "Mr. Browder, have they given you anything to eat or drink?" "No," I answered. He made a little humming noise, and I thanked him before saying goodbye. I tried to make myself comfortable in a plastic chair, but couldn't. Time crawled by. I got up. I paced through a certain curtain wall of cigarette smoke. I tried to look at the vacant stares of the other men who were also being detained. I checked my email. I called Ariel, but he didn't answer. I walked to the glass and started talking to the officers in my poor Russian. They ignored me. I was nobody to them. Worse, I was already a prisoner. It bears mentioning that in Russia, there is no respect for the individual and his or her rights. People can be sacrificed for the needs of the state, used as shields, trading chips, or even simple fodder. If necessary, anyone can disappear. A famous expression of Stalin drives right to the point. If there is no man, there is no problem. That's when Jude Shaw from the Forbes article wedged back into my consciousness. Should I have been more conscious and cautious in my past? I had gone so used to fighting oligarchs and corrupt Russian officials that I had been inured of the possibility that if someone wanted it badly enough, I could disappear too. I shook my head, forcing Jude out of my mind. I went back to the guards to get something, anything out of them, but it was useless. I went back to my seat and called Ariel again. This time he answered. What's going on, Ariel? I've spoken to several people and none of them are talking. What do you mean none of them are talking? I mean none of them are talking. I'm sorry, Bill, but I need more time. It's Saturday night. Sunday night. No one's available. Okay. Let me know as soon as you hear anything. I will. We hung up. I called the embassy again. They hadn't made any progress either. They were getting stonewalled, or I wasn't in the system yet, or both. Before hanging up, the consul asked again, have they given you anything to eat or drink? No, I repeated. It seemed such a meaningless question, but Chris Browder clearly thought otherwise. He had expertise with this situation before, and it struck me as a very Russian tactic not to offer food or water. The room filled with more detainees as the clock passed midnight. All were men. All looked as if they had come from former Soviet republics. Georgians, Albanians, Kazakhs, Armenians. Their luggage, if they had any, were simple duffel bags or strange, oversized nylon shopping bags that were all taped up. Each man smoking sensibly. Some spoke in low whispers. None showed any kind of emotion or concern. They made as much effort to notice me as the guards did, even though I was clearly a fish out of water. Nervous. Blue blazer, Blackberry, black rolling suitcase. I called Elenia again. Anything on your end? She sighed. No? And yours? Nothing. She must have heard the concern in my voice. It'll be fine, Bill. If it really is just a visa issue, you'll be back here tomorrow. I'm sure of it. Her calmness helped. I know. I looked at my watch. It was 10:30 p.m. in England. Go to sleep, honey. You and the baby need the rest. Okay. I'll call you straight away if I get any information. Me too. Good night. Good night. I love you, I added, but she had already hung up. A flicker of doubt crossed my mind. What if this simply wasn't a visa issue? Would I ever see Elena again? Would I ever meet our unborn child? Would I ever see my son, David? As I fought through these dire situations and feelings, I tried to arrange myself across the hard chairs, using my jacket as a pillow, but the chairs were made for preventing sleep, not to mention I was surrounded by a bunch of menacing-looking men. How was I to drift off around these characters? I wasn't. I sat up and started typing on my BlackBerry, reading the list of people who had met over the years in Russia, Britain, and America who might be able to help me. Politicians, business people, reporters. Chris Bowers called me one last time before his shift ended at the embassy. He assured me that people taking over for him would be fully briefed. He still wanted to know if they had been offered food or water. I hadn't. He apologized, even though there was nothing he could do. He was clearly keeping a record of mistreatment should the need for one ever arise. After we hung up, I thought, shit. By then, it was 2 or 3 in the morning. I turned off my BlackBerry to conserve its battery. Tired again to sleep, I threw a shirt from my bag over my eyes. I dry swallowed 2 Advil for a headache that had started. I tried to forget it all. I tried to convince myself that I'd be leaving tomorrow, that this was just a problem with my visa. One way or another, I'd be leaving Russia. After a long time, I drifted off. I woke around 6:30 a.m. when there was a crunch of new detainees. Most of the same, no one like me. More cigarettes, more whispering. The smell of sweat increased by several orders of magnitude. My mouth tasted foul, and for the first time, I realized how thirsty I was. Chris Browder had been right to ask if they had offered me anything to eat or drink. We had access to a rank toilet, but these bastards should have given us food and water. At the same time, I had awakened feeling positive that this was just a bureaucratic misunderstanding. I called Ariel. He still hadn't been able to figure out what was going on, but he did say that the next flight to London left at 11:15 a.m. I had only 2 alternatives. I would either be arrested or deported. so I tried to convince myself that I'd be on that flight. I busied myself as best as I could. I answered some emails as if it was a normal work day. I checked with the embassy. The new consul on duty assured me that once things started opening for the day, they'd take care of me. I got my stuff together and tried once more to talk to the guards. I asked them for my passport, but they continued to ignore me. It was as if they were only doing their job to sit behind the glass and ignore all detainees. I paced. 9 o'clock, 9:15, 9:24, 9:37. I grew more and more nervous. I wanted to call Elena, but it was too early in London. I called Ariel, and he still had nothing for me. I stopped calling people. By 10:30 a.m., I was banging on the glass, and the officers still ignored me with utmost professionalism. Elena called. This time, she couldn't soothe me. She promised we'd figure out my situation, but I was starting to feel like it didn't matter. Jude Shao was looming large in my mind now. 10:45. I really began to panic. 10:51. How could I have been so stupid? Why would an average guy from the south side of Chicago think he could get away with talking down one Russian oligarch after another? 10:58. Stupid, 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 arrogant and stupid, arrogant and just plain stupid. 11:02. I'm going to a Russian prison. I'm going to a Russian prison. I'm going to a Russian prison. 11:05. Two jack-booted officers stormed in the room and made a beeline for me. They grabbed my arms and gathered my stuff and pulled me from the detention room. They took me out through the halls and up a flight of stairs. This was it. I was going to get thrown into a paddy wagon and taken away. Then they kicked open a door, and there was the departures terminal, and moving fast. My heart lifted as we passed the gates and gawking passengers. Then we were at the gate at 11:15 London flight, and I was being ushered down the jetway and onto the plane. And hustled through the business class and deposited in the middle seat in coach. The officers didn't say a word. They put my bag in the overhead compartment. They didn't give me my passport. They left. People on the plane tried hard not to stare. How could they not? I ignored them. I was not going to a Russian prison. I texted Elena, and I was on my way home, and I would see her soon again. I texted her that I loved her. We took off. The wheels thumped into the fuselage. I experienced the largest sense of relief I had ever felt in my life. Making and losing money by the hundreds of millions of dollars didn't compare. We reached cruising altitude, and the meal service came around. I'd eaten for more than 24 hours. Lunch that day was some kind of awful beef stroganoff, but it was the best thing I'd ever eaten. I took 3 extra rolls, drank 4 bottles of water, and then I passed out. I didn't wake until the plane hit the runway in England. As we taxied, I made a mental catalog of all things I was going to deal with. First and foremost was working my way through British customs without a passport. But that would be easy enough. England was my home, and ever since I had taken British citizenship in 1998, my adopted country. The bigger picture had to do with Russia. How was I going to get out of this mess? Who was responsible for it? Whom could I call in Russia? Whom in the West? The plane stopped, the public address system chimed, and the seat belts came off. When it was my turn, I walked down the aisle to the exit. I was totally preoccupied. I got closer to the exit and didn't notice the pilot at the front watching the passengers deplane. When I reached him, he interrupted my thoughts by holding out a hand. I looked at him. In it was my British passport. I took it without saying a word. Customs took 5 minutes. I got in a cab and walked to my apartment in London. When I arrived, I gave Alina a long hug. I had never felt so thankful for the embrace of another person. I told her how much I loved her. She gave me a big, doe-eyed smile. We spoke about my predicament as we made our way, hand in hand, to our shared home office. We sat at our desks, we turned on the computers, and picked up the phones and got to work. I had to figure out how I was going to return to Russia. Chapter 2. How do you rebel against a family of communists? Well, that's an interesting one. If you heard me speaking now, you'd probably ask, how is this guy with an American accent and a British passport become the largest foreign investor in Russia, only to get kicked out? It's a long story, and one that indeed started in America, in an unusual American family. My grandfather, Bill Browder, was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas. He was so good at his job that he was spotted by the communists and invited to join to the Soviet Union in 1926. Not long after he got there, he did what most red-blooded American men do in Moscow. He met a good-looking Russian girl. Her name was Rosa Bergman. They fell in love and got married. They would have 3 boys. The first was my father, Felix, who was born in the Russian capital in July of 1927. In 1932, Earl returned to the United States, moving his family to Yonkers, New York. to head the American Communist Party. He ran for president twice on the Communist ticket, in 1936 and 1940. Even though he had garnered only about 80,000 votes in each race, Errol's candidacy focused Depression-era America on the failings of mainstream capitalism and caused all political players to revise their policies leftward. He was effective. He was so effective that he appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1938 with the caption, "Comrade Earl Browder." The same effectiveness also drew the ire of President Roosevelt in 1941, after my grandfather was arrested and convicted for passport violations. He began serving 4 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Georgia. Fortunately, due to a Second World War alliances between the United States and the Soviet Union, Earl was pardoned 1 year later. After the war ended, Earl spent the next few years in the political wilderness until Senator Joseph McCarthy started his infamous witch hunt trying to rid the country of every last communist. The 1950s was a paranoid time in America. It didn't matter if you were a good communist or a bad communist, you were still a communist. Earl was subordinated and interrogated for months by the House Un-American Activities Committee. My grandfather's political persecution and beliefs weighed heavily on the rest of the family. My grandmother was a Russian Jewish intellectual and no desire for any of her sons to go into the dirty business of politics. For her, the highest calling was academia, specifically in science or mathematics. Felix, my father, dutifully lived up and exceeded her expectations. Attending MIT at the age of 16, remarkably, he had received his bachelor's degree in only 2 years, enrolled in Princeton's math program, and had his PhD at age 20. Even though my father was one of America's brightest young mathematicians, he was still the son of Earl Browder. When President Truman instituted the peacetime draft after the Second World War, Felix asked for a deferment, but his employer, the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, refused to write a letter for him. None of his superiors wanted to be on the record defending the son of the famous communist. With no deferment on file, Felix was promptly drafted and started serving the Army in 1953. After basic training, my father was assigned to an Army intelligence unit at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where he worked for several weeks before his commanding officer noticed his last name. The wheels turned quickly then. Late one night, Felix was yanked from his bunk, thrown into a military transport, and taken to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he was assigned to pump gas at service stations on the edge of the base for the next 2 years. When he was discharged in 1955, he applied for the first academic job opening he found, junior professor position at Braddock's University. The Braddock's faculty couldn't believe their luck at having a top Princeton mathematician applying for the job, but when they presented the recommendation, the Board of Trustees balked at the idea of supporting the son of the ex-leader of the American Communist Party. At the time, Eleanor Roosevelt was the chair of the board. Even though her husband was the one responsible for imprisoning my grandfather, she said it would be the most un-American thing we could do to deny a great scientist his profession because of whom his father was. Felix ultimately got the job, which led to the positions at Yale, Princeton, and the University of Chicago, where he eventually became chairman of the math department. He had a long and successful career, and in 1999, Principal Clinton awarded him the National Medal of Science, the top mathematics honor in the country. My mother's story was no less remarkable. Eva was born to a Jewish single mother in Vienna in 1929. By 1938, it was obvious that the Nazis were targeting Jews, and any Jew had the opportunity to get as far away from Europe as possible. Because so many people were fleeing, getting a U.S. visa was almost impossible, and my grandmother made the heartbreaking decision to put my mother up for adoption just so she could have a chance at a better life in America. The Applebaums, a nice Jewish family in Belmont, Massachusetts, agreed to take in Eva. At the age of 9, she traveled alone across Europe by train, got on a steamship, and sailed to America to meet her new family. When she got there, she was amazed by the sanctuary into which she stumbled. For the next few years, my mother lived comfortably in a house with her own room, a cocker spaniel, a mowed lawn, and no genocidal war raging around her. As Eva was adjusting to her new life, my grandmother Erna managed to escape Austria, getting as far as the United Kingdom. The separation from her daughter was unbearable, and she spent every day trying to get a U.S. visa so she could reunite with Eva. After 3 years, the visa finally came. She traveled from England to Boston and showed up on the Applebaum's doorstep in Belmont, expecting a joyful reunion. However, my grandmother was greeted by a child she barely knew. an American girl who became so comfortable with the apple bombs that she didn't want to leave. After a traumatizing struggle, my grandmother prevailed, and the two of them moved into a one-room tenement in Brookline, Massachusetts. My grandmother worked 80 hours a week as a seamstress to support them, but they were so poor that their main luxury was sharing a tray of roast beef and mashed potatoes once a week at a local cafeteria. Going from poverty to comfort and then back to poverty was so traumatic that to this day, my mother collects sugar packets and sneakers rolls from the restaurant bread baskets into her handbag. In spite of her meager teenage life, my mother excelled academically and was offered a full scholarship to MIT. She met Felix there in 1948, and written a few months later, they were married. I was born in 1964 into a strange academic left-wing family. The main topics of conversation at the dinner table was mathematical theorems and how the world was going to hell because of crooked businessmen. My older brother Thomas followed in my father's footsteps and attended University of Chicago at the age of 15. He graduated, Phi Beta Kappa, of course, with a degree in physics. He went straight into a PhD program at the age of 19, and now is one of the world's top particle physicists. I, on the other hand, lived on the opposite end of the academic spectrum. When I was 12, my parents announced that they were taking a year-long sabbatical and gave me the option of joining them or going to boarding school. I chose the latter. Feeling guilty, my mother allowed me to choose which school I wanted. Since I wasn't interested in academics, but I was interested in skiing, I looked at what schools were close to ski areas and found a tiny one called the Whiteman School, located in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. My parents were so involved in their own academics world that they didn't bother to conduct any diligence on the school. Had they done so, they would discover that at the time Whitman was a less than selective school that attracted a number of problem students, kids who had been kicked out of their other schools or had problems with the law. In order to attend this boarding school, I had to skip 8th grade, and so I arrived at Whiteman School as a small 13-year-old, the youngest and smallest student there. When the other students saw the scrawny boy dressed in a blue blazer, they immediately saw a victim. On the first day, a band of students came to my room and started rummaging through my drawers, taking whatever they wanted. When I objected, they jumped me, held me down, chanted over and over, "Time for titty twisters! Billy Browder! Time for titty twisters!" This scene played out night after night for the first few weeks. I was bruised and humiliated, and every night when the lights went out, I was terrified of the horrors these kids had in store for me. My mother came to visit at the beginning of October. Out of pride, I hadn't told her anything about what was going on. I hated all of it, but I thought I could take it. As soon as my mother got in her car to dinner, though, I broke down. Alarmed, she asked me what was going on. "I hate it here," I yelled through tears. "It's terrible." I decided not to tell her about being beat up every night or the titty twisters, but I didn't know whether she suspected any of it. But she said, "Billy, if you don't want to stay here, just say so. I'll take you back to Europe with me." I thought about it and didn't give her an answer right away. As we got closer to the restaurant, I decided, while returning to the warm bosom of my mother sounded like the most appealing things in the world at the moment, I didn't want to walk away from Whiteman, a defeated loser. We got a table at the restaurant and ordered our food. I calmed down as we ate, and halfway through the meal, I looked at her and said, I think I'll stay. I'll make it work." We spent the weekend together away from the school, and she dropped me off on Saturday night. After saying goodbye, I returned to my room. As I passed the sophomore bunk area, I could hear a pair of boys hissing, "TT's for BB, TT's for BB." I started walking faster, but the two boys got up and followed me. I was so full of anger and humiliation that, just before turning the corner in my room, I spun and lunged at the smaller boy. I hit him square in the nose. He fell down, and I got right on top of him and kept punching him, blood splattering on his face until his friend grabbed me by the shoulders and threw me aside. The two of them gave me a good beating before the housemaster showed up to stop the fight. From that moment on, no one ever touched me again at Whiteman School. I spent the whole year there and learned about all sorts of things I'd never known. I started smoking cigarettes, sneaking out at night, and bringing hard alcohol back to the dorms. I got into so much trouble that I was expelled the next year. I returned to my family in Chicago, but I was not the same Billy Browder. In my family, if you weren't a prodigy, then you had no place on earth. I was so far off the rails that my parents didn't know what to do with me. They sent me to a string of psychiatrists, counselors, and doctors trying to determine how I could be fixed. The more this went on, the more forcefully I rebelled. Rejecting school was a good start, but I really wanted to upset my parents, then I would have to come up with something else. Then, towards the end of high school, it hit me. I would put a suit and tie on and become a capitalist. Nothing would piss my family off more than that. Okay. I will leave it at this, reading chapter 1 and chapter 2. I'll read chapter 3 and chapter 4 tomorrow, and I hope you all have an amazing day. Thank you all for listening, and if you guys didn't know, I decided to make a Ko-Fi for myself to try and improve the channel. To be completely honest, I just want to better myself, make better videos, and hopefully eventually get to a point where people can enjoy watching. Hope that you all are having an amazing day, night, or evening, and I wish you all the best. This is the Calm Reader signing off, and I say good day.